Havensville woke up to the sound of factory horns, just like it had every morning for the past 50 years. This industrial town of 15,000 people lived by a strict schedule: breakfast at 7, work from 8 to 5, dinner at 6. Everyone knew each other here, and news traveled faster than the internet. Iris Brown stood at the kitchen window of her 2-story house on Maple Street, watching her husband Dan load his pickup truck with tools. At 28, she still looked like the girl he had met 6 years ago at the Red Lantern bar. Delicate features, shoulder-length auburn hair that she always styled neatly before work. But now her figure was adorned with a noticeable baby bump, 6 months along. "Don't forget your appointment with Dr. Stone at 4 today," she called through the open window. Dan looked up, smiled, and waved. At 32, he had retained the athletic build he had had in his school football days, although his years as a mechanic at the Havensville steel plant had left their mark. Calloused hands, perpetually dirty under his fingernails despite his best efforts to keep them clean. "Sure, baby. See you later for the ultrasound," he replied, starting the engine. Iris watched his truck until it disappeared around the corner. Only then did she allow herself to breathe deeply. Something had changed in their relationship over the past few weeks. It wasn't that they had been fighting, quite the opposite, in fact. Dan had become even more attentive and caring since he found out about the pregnancy, but Iris felt like an actress playing the role of a happy wife. Half an hour later, she was sitting at her desk at Midwest Freight Solutions, a logistics company located in a small building on the industrial outskirts of the city. The company organized freight transportation throughout the Midwest, and Iris, as senior administrator, coordinated routes, communicated with drivers and customers, and kept track of paperwork. "Good morning, future mom," said Jane Foster, her best friend and colleague in the department. Jane had been working as an administrative assistant for 2 years, ever since she moved to Havensville from Columbus after her divorce. "Hi, Jane. How was your weekend?" Iris turned on her computer and started checking her email. "Boring as usual. How about you and Dan?" "The usual. He was working on his car in the garage, and I was reading books for expectant mothers." Iris shrugged. "You know, sometimes I feel like we live like roommates, not husband and wife." Jane looked closely at her friend. In their 6 years of friendship, she had seen Iris and Dan's relationship change. For the first 2 years, they had been inseparable. Then came the attempts to have a baby, the failures, the stress, and gradually their passionate romance turned into a measured existence. "What's the appointment with Dr. Stone today?" Jane asked, even though she knew the answer. "A routine checkup, an ultrasound. Dan wants to know the sex of the baby, but I'm not ready yet," Iris said thoughtfully, touching her belly. "It's strange, but every time we go to the doctor, I get more and more nervous." At that moment, at the Havenville Medical Center, Dr. Michael Stone was reviewing his list of patients for the day. The 35-year-old obstetrician-gynecologist had moved to the town 2 years ago from Chicago, telling everyone he was tired of the big city and wanted to help people in a more peaceful environment. In reality, the reason for his move was a scandal involving a married patient that nearly cost him his career. Michael was the complete opposite of the men in Havensville. Tall, elegant, always impeccably dressed, he spoke in a soft, educated voice and was a good listener. The women in town adored him. The men treated him with suspicion, but no one could deny his professionalism. When he saw Iris Brown's name on the schedule for the next 4 evenings, he smiled involuntarily. Over the past 3 months, she had become his favorite patient, not only because her pregnancy was going perfectly, but also because he could talk to her about more than just medical issues. Iris was intelligent, well-read, and had a subtle sense of humor that was sorely lacking in the provincial environment. Meanwhile, at the factory, Dan Brown tried to focus on repairing the conveyor belt, but his thoughts kept returning to Iris. Over the past few months, he had noticed that his wife had become distracted, often staying late at work and talking about the need to work overtime to prepare for her maternity leave. Dan didn't suspect anything bad. He was just worried about her condition. "Hey, Brown, you're flying high today," joked his partner Tom Wilson, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a good-natured face. "Thinking about my wife and baby," Dan admitted honestly. "You know, Tom, I've dreamed about this for so long. After all the failed attempts, the doctors, the tests, and now that it's finally happening, sometimes it feels like a dream. Tom nodded approvingly. I understand. When my Susie was born, I couldn't believe it was true for a week. But I'll tell you honestly, my friend, fatherhood will change you forever, and not always in the way you expect. After lunch, Iris felt a familiar excitement. Visits to Dr. Stone had become something special to her, not just because of her concern for the baby, but because of him. Michael was the first man in many years who really listened to her, who was interested in her thoughts and dreams. With him, she could talk about the books she was reading, her plans for the future, her fears about motherhood. Jane, I'm going to leave a little early to get ready for the appointment, she said, gathering her bag. Sure, say hi to the handsome doctor for me. Jane winked, unaware of how accurately she had hit the mark. Iris arrived at Dr. Stone's office at the medical center at exactly 4 o'clock. He greeted her with his usual professional smile, but there was something more than just medical concern in his eyes. How are you feeling, Iris? Is the baby okay? He helped her settle down on the couch. Everything's fine. It's just hard to sleep sometimes. He's very active at night, she smiled, looking at the doctor. That's normal. Children often confuse day and night while still in the womb. Michael began the examination, his hands warm and confident. How are things at home? Is your husband helping? Iris thought for a moment. Dan tries. He's a good man, caring, but sometimes I feel like we live in parallel worlds. All he thinks about is work, football with his friends, fixing the car, and me. And you? And I think about how life is passing me by, that there is something else out there besides this house and this job, but I don't know what. Michael stopped and looked at her intently. You're a very intelligent woman, Iris, and you deserve to be understood and appreciated not only as a wife and future mother, but also as a person. Their eyes met, and there was a tension in the air that couldn't be explained by mere medical concern. At that moment, the office door opened and Dan entered with a bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. Sorry I'm late, doctor, he said, approaching his wife and kissing her on the cheek. Hi, honey. How's our little one? Michael quickly returned to his professional manner. Everything is fine, Mr. Brown. Your baby is developing beautifully. Would you like to see the ultrasound? The next half hour passed in the usual atmosphere of a doctor's office. Dan looked admiringly at the monitor screen, where the outlines of their future child could be seen, and asked many questions about development, nutrition, and preparation for childbirth. Iris answered mechanically, but her thoughts were far away. Next appointment in 2 weeks, Dr. Stone said, as they were about to leave. And remember, Iris, if you have any questions or concerns, call any time. Dan didn't even notice how the doctor pronounced his wife's name. Too softly, too intimately for a doctor. The drive home was silent. Dan was happy and excited after the doctor's visit, talking about how he wanted to decorate the nursery and what kind of crib to buy. Iris nodded and smiled, but inside she was in turmoil. At home, over the dinner Dan had prepared himself, roast chicken and potatoes, their usual meal. He brought up the subject of the baby again. You know, honey, I think it's going to be a boy. Did you see him kicking on the ultrasound? He's going to be a soccer player. Dan beamed with happiness. Maybe, Iris replied quietly, poking at her food with her fork. You're not eating. Is something wrong? I'm just tired. I had a hard day at work. Dan stood up, walked over to her, and put his arms around her shoulders. You know what? Soon you'll be on maternity leave and you'll be able to rest. I'll work for both of us to provide for our family. Iris felt tears welling up in her eyes. Dan was such a good man, sincere and loving, and she felt like a monster for what was going on in her head and heart. That night, lying in bed next to her peacefully sleeping husband, Iris couldn't sleep. The baby was moving around, as if it could sense her anxiety. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered, "What are we going to do, baby?" Outside, Havensville slept peacefully, unaware of the turmoil raging behind the walls of an ordinary house on Maple Street. 2 weeks had passed since her last visit to the doctor. The October morning in Havensville greeted residents with cold rain and gray clouds. Iris sat at her desk at Midwest Freight Solutions, But instead of doing her usual paperwork, she checked her phone for the third time that morning. "You seem nervous today," Jane remarked as she brought her coffee. "Is something wrong?" "Everything's fine. It's just pregnancy hormones," Iris lied, quickly putting her phone in her bag. In reality, everything was far from normal. For the past 2 weeks, Iris had been living in a state of constant inner conflict. Every time Dan asked her how she was feeling or talked about his plans for their future as a family, she felt a sharp pang of guilt. But when he left for work, her thoughts inevitably returned to Dr. Stone, to his intelligent eyes, his soft voice, the way he listened to her attentively. At 11 o'clock, the work phone rang. "Midwest Freight Solutions, Iris Brown speaking," she answered with her usual formula. "Iris, this is Dr. Stone." The familiar voice made her heart race. "Don't worry, the baby is fine. I just wanted to clarify some details from your medical records." "Of course, doctor. What exactly?" Ira tried to sound professional, but her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "It's best to discuss this in person. I have a window around lunchtime, around 12:30, if that's convenient for you." Ira glanced at Jane, who pretended not to be listening, concentrating intently on the documents in front of her. "Okay, I'll be there." "Great. See you then, Iris." After she hung up, silence fell over the office. "Something serious?" Jane asked cautiously. "Just a routine consultation," Iris replied, but inside she was churning with excitement and anticipation. At the medical center, Dr. Stone had finished seeing his last patient before lunch and was alone in his office. He knew full well that calling Iris at work under the pretext of a medical consultation was unethical. But for the past 2 weeks, he hadn't been able to get her out of his head. Michael Stone had always considered himself a high-class professional. In Chicago, he had a successful practice, a reputation, and the respect of his colleagues. But one affair with a married patient ruined everything. He vowed never to cross the line between doctor and patient again. And now, in this backwater town, he was once again standing on the edge of a precipice. But Iris was special. She was intelligent, sensitive, clearly unhappy in her marriage to a simple mechanic. Michael saw her withering away in the routine of provincial life and wanted to give her something more. At 12:30, Iris entered his office. She was excited, as evidenced by the pink blush on her cheeks and her rapid breathing. "Please sit down." Michael closed the office door and turned the key. "I want to apologize for deceiving you. There are no medical issues." "Then why did you ask me here?" Iris sank into the chair, placing her hands on her rounded belly. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you. About what you said last time. That life is passing you by." Michael sat down opposite her, their knees almost touching. "Iris, you deserve more than this gray life as a housewife in a provincial town." "I have a husband. I'm about to have a baby," she objected weakly, but there was no conviction in her voice. "You have a partner who sees you only as a function, a wife, a future mother. But I see an intelligent, beautiful woman who could live a completely different life." Michael reached out and gently touched her hand. Iris didn't pull it away. "This is wrong," she whispered. "What's wrong? That I value you as a person? That I can talk to you about Dostoevsky, about dreams, about feelings? When was the last time your husband was interested in what you think about anything other than baby food and diapers?" Iris felt tears welling up in her eyes. Michael was right. Dan had never been interested in her inner world. To him, she was the woman he loved, but he loved his image of her more than the real Iris. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of what I feel for you, of wanting more, of destroying my whole life." Michael stood up from the chair and walked over to her. Gently, as if she were a fragile porcelain doll, he helped her up and hugged her. Iris pressed herself against his chest, breathing in the scent of his expensive cologne, so unlike the motor oil and sweat that Dan always smelled like. "Sometimes you have to take a risk to really live," he whispered in her ear. They stood there for a few minutes, just hugging. Then Michael stepped back and looked into her eyes. "Think about it. If you decide to meet outside the hospital, I have a small house outside the city. It's a quiet place where we could just talk. Iris nodded, not trusting her voice, and quickly left the office. Meanwhile, at the factory, Dan was trying to concentrate on repairing the lifting mechanism, but something was bothering him. In recent weeks, Iris had become even more distracted and silent. When he tried to talk to her about preparing for the birth or choosing a name for the baby, she answered in monosyllables and quickly found an excuse to leave the room. "Tom, can I ask you some advice?" he asked his experienced partner during a break. "Sure, man. What's up?" Iris has been acting strange. She seems distant. Is that normal for pregnant women? Tom shook his head thoughtfully. Every woman is different. But when my wife was pregnant with Susie, she became more demanding for attention. She wanted me to be around all the time, telling her how much I loved her. What if a woman pulls away? It can vary. Hormones, fears about childbirth, worries about the future. Tom looked intently at Dan. Or maybe she feels that you've changed too. You've become more focused on work, on making money for the family, and you've forgotten to pay attention to her. Dan thought about it. Indeed, in recent months, he had been completely absorbed in thoughts of financial stability for his family. He had taken on extra shifts, planned to buy a more reliable car, and saved money for children's furniture. Perhaps Iris felt neglected. Thanks, Tom. Tonight, I'll make her a romantic dinner, like in the old days. That evening, Iris came home from work and found the house decorated with candles. The kitchen smelled of her favorite dish, lasagna, which Dan only made on special occasions. He greeted her at the door wearing a clean shirt, obviously having just taken a shower and shaved. "What's all this?" she asked, taking off her coat. "I just want to spend the evening with my beloved wife." Dan helped her hang up her coat and kissed her on the cheek. "I realized that I haven't been paying enough attention to you lately. I've been thinking about money and work, and forgot about the most important thing." Iris felt a new pang of guilt. Dan was trying to be a good husband, and over dinner, he talked about his plans for the nursery, how he wanted to teach the child to fish and play soccer if it was a boy, or ride a bike if it was a girl. "What do you think we'll have?" he asked. "I don't know. It doesn't matter," Iris said mechanically, eating her lasagna and thinking about her meeting with Michael that day. "Iris, what's wrong? You seem distant." She looked up at her husband. There was genuine concern and slight anxiety in his eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm just tired. I have a lot to do at work right now. I need to hand everything over to Jane before she goes on maternity leave." "Maybe you should take your vacation early. We have savings, we'll get by." "No, it's fine. I like my job." After dinner, they sat on the sofa watching TV. Dan hugged Iris around the shoulders, and she lay leaning against his chest. It was an idyllic picture of a happy family, but inside Iris was in turmoil. The phone rang around 10 o'clock in the evening. Dan looked at the caller ID. "Unknown number," he said, handing the phone to Iris. "Hello?" she answered, and her heart skipped a beat when she heard the familiar voice. "Iris, it's Michael Stone. Sorry for calling so late, but I wanted to make sure you were okay after our conversation earlier today." Dan raised an eyebrow in surprise. Doctors didn't usually call patients at home in the evening. "Yes, doctor. Everything's fine," Iris said, trying to sound as neutral as possible. "Excellent. And the offer we discussed is still on the table. Think about it." "Okay. Thanks for calling." After she hung up, Dan asked, "What kind of offer?" "Dr. Stone is offering additional consultations to prepare for childbirth. She says it's helpful for first-time mothers. Sounds reasonable. If you think it will help, go ahead." Iris nodded, hating herself for the ease with which she had lied to her husband. The next day at the office, Jane immediately noticed the change in her friend's behavior. "You're glowing," she said. "Did you have a nice romantic dinner with Dan last night? How did you know about dinner?" "Girl intuition. Plus, you're smiling for the first time in a week." Iris couldn't tell Jane the truth, that she wasn't smiling because of Dan, but because of the chance to see Michael. She took yesterday's phone call as a sign. He was thinking about her, worried about her. Around lunchtime, she made up her mind. "Jane, I need to step out for a couple of hours. Tell the boss I have a doctor's appointment." "Sure. Is everything okay?" "Yes, just a checkup." Iris grabbed her bag and headed for the exit. her heart pounding with excitement and fear. She was crossing a line from which there would be no turning back. Michael was waiting for her at the medical center with a bouquet of white roses. "I thought you weren't coming," he said when she entered the office. "I thought so too until the last minute. What made you change your mind?" "That you're right. Life is passing me by, and I'm afraid I'm not really living it." Michael walked over to her and handed her the flowers. "Then let's go to the lake. No one will see us there, and we can just talk." Iris took the bouquet and nodded. At that moment, she finally crossed the line between a faithful wife and a woman willing to risk everything for a feeling that was just beginning to blossom. They left the hospital through the staff exit and got into Michael's silver Mercedes. As they drove along the winding road to Haven Lake, 15 minutes outside the city, Iris thought about how Dan was working hard at the factory to support their family, unaware that his wife was on her way to meet another man. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked, glancing at her pensive face. "That I'm a terrible person." "No, you're just a living person who wants to be happy. There's nothing terrible about that." At the lake, they walked along the shore, talking about books, dreams, and what life could be like in the big city. Michael told her about the theaters and museums in Chicago, and she told him about her desire to see the world someday. When it started to drizzle, they took shelter in a small gazebo. "Iris," Michael took her hand, "I know this is difficult, but what we have is real. I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." She looked into his eyes and realized she was in love. For the first time in her life, she was truly in love with a man who saw her not only as a wife and mother, but as a woman. When they returned to town 2 hours later, Iris knew her old life was over. A new one was beginning, full of risk, guilt, and happiness all at once. November in Havensville was particularly cold. The first snow fell 2 weeks earlier than usual, and the town was wrapped in a white blanket that made it seem even more sleepy and provincial. Iris stood at her bedroom window, watching Dan clear the snow from the driveway. 8 months pregnant, she was already having trouble moving around, but that wasn't the main reason for her pensiveness. Over the past month, her life had changed dramatically. Her meetings with Michael had become regular, twice a week under the pretext of additional consultations. They spent time at his country house, talking, reading together, and with each meeting, Iris sank deeper into this parallel world where she was not just the pregnant wife of a mechanic, but an intelligent, desirable woman. "Baby, breakfast is ready," Dan called from downstairs. Iris struggled to get up from her chair and went down to the kitchen. Dan had already set the table with oatmeal, toast, and freshly squeezed orange juice. In recent weeks, he had become almost obsessively caring, as if trying to compensate for something. "Do you have a doctor's appointment today?" he asked, spreading butter on his toast. "Yes, at 2 o'clock. Iris avoided looking him in the eye when she lied. "Maybe I'll go with you? I have a short day today. Wilson said they can manage without me." "No, it's okay," she replied too quickly. "It's just a routine checkup. Why waste your time?" Dan looked closely at his wife. Over the past few weeks, he had noticed more and more moments like this, when Iris displayed a strange independence, refused his help, and became withdrawn after visits to the doctor. "Iris, is everything okay? Between us?" She finally looked up and saw genuine concern in his eyes. Dan truly loved her, and that made her betrayal even more painful. "Of course, I'm just nervous about giving birth. It's normal." "You know, Dr. Stone seems a little too attentive to me," Dan said cautiously. "I mean, he often schedules extra appointments for you." Iris's heart skipped a beat. "He's just a good doctor. He cares about his patients." "I'm sure he is. But I still don't feel comfortable with a stranger spending more time with my wife than I do." There was no direct accusation in Dan's words, but Iris felt a chill run down her spine. Could he suspect something? Meanwhile, at the medical center, Dr. Stone was preparing for his meeting with Iris. The last few weeks had been a period of strange happiness mixed with constant anxiety. He had fallen in love with this woman in a way he hadn't felt in many years, but he knew their relationship had reached an impasse. Iris was in her last month of pregnancy and due to give birth soon. What would happen then? How long could they hide their relationship in a small town where everyone knew each other? And most importantly, was she ready to leave her husband for him? At 2 o'clock, Iris entered his office. She looked tired and upset. "What's wrong?" Michael asked immediately, helping her sit down. "Dan is starting to suspect something. This morning he asked why I had so many extra appointments." Michael frowned. "It was inevitable. It's hard to keep anything secret for long in a town like this. What should we do?" "Iris, we need to talk seriously about the future." Michael sat down opposite her and took her hands. "I love you. I want to be with you. But this can't go on." "I know, I love you too." Tears welled up in her eyes. "But how can I leave Dan now? He's a good man. He doesn't deserve this." "And what do you deserve? A life without love, without understanding, without real happiness? I'm going to have a baby." "Our baby," Michael said quietly. Iris shuddered. They had never spoken about it directly, but they both understood that the child had been conceived during their first intimate encounter a month ago, when emotion had overcome reason. "Dan must never know about this. Never," she whispered. "But the child has a right to know his real father." "No, you don't understand what it would destroy. Not just my life, but Dan's life too. He wanted this child so badly." Michael stood up and walked over to the window. Snowflakes swirled slowly outside, and Havensville looked like the setting for a Christmas card, peaceful and deceptively calm. "Iris, I've been offered a job in Chicago. It's a big clinic with good pay. Come with me. We'll start a new life." "I can't." You can. Tell Dan you need treatment in a big city, that the local medicine isn't good enough for childbirth. You'll give birth in Chicago, and then what? Tell him I'm not coming back? With his child? With our child?" Iris stood up as abruptly as she could in her condition. "Michael, stop it. I can't just disappear. My whole life is here. My job, my friend, my family." "What family? A husband who sees you as nothing more than a baby maker? That's not fair. Dan loves me. He loves his idea of you. I love the real Iris. Smart, sensitive, complex." They stood at opposite ends of the office, staring at each other. Between them lay a gulf of different views on their future. "I need time to think," Iris said. "We're running out of time. In a week or two, you'll give birth, and everything will become even more complicated." After her visit to the doctor, Iris didn't go straight home. She asked the taxi driver to take her to Haven Lake, where she and Michael had had their first date. Despite the cold, she sat on a bench for a long time, thinking about what her life had become. She really loved Michael. With him, she felt alive, interesting, desired. But did she love him enough to ruin Dan's life? And what would happen to the child who would grow up without a father? Or with a stepfather he considered his biological father? The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Dan. "Baby, where are you? It's 5 o'clock." Iris looked at her watch and was horrified. She had been sitting by the lake for almost 3 hours. "I'm sorry, I was held up after my appointment. Dr. Stone recommended a walk in the fresh air." "In this cold? Iris, you're 8 months pregnant." "Everything's fine. I'm on my way home." Dan met her at the door with a cup of hot tea and a blanket. "You're freezing," he said, wrapping her up and sitting her down in an armchair by the fireplace. "What did the doctor say?" "Everything's fine. The baby is healthy and developing normally." "When is the baby due?" "In 2 or 3 weeks." Dan sat down next to her and put his hand on her belly. The baby immediately responded with a strong kick, and Dan's face lit up with a happy smile. "He knows his dad," he said tenderly. Iris closed her eyes, feeling tears sting her eyelids. If Dan only knew the truth. "Dan, what if the birth is difficult? What if the hospital here isn't equipped?" "What are you talking about? Thousands of babies have been born here. But this is my first child. There could be complications." Dan looked at his wife intently. "Did Dr. Stone say anything?" "No, I just read that sometimes it's better to give birth in a large clinic where they have all the necessary equipment." "Iris, you're scaring me. Is there a problem?" "No, I just want everything to go well." Dan hugged her tighter. "Everything will be fine. I'll be there. Dr. Stone is a professional. You're safe." That night, Dan couldn't sleep for a long time. Iris's behavior was becoming increasingly strange. At first, he blamed it on pregnancy, hormones, and natural fears about childbirth. But today's conversation about big clinics had alarmed him. Did she really want to give birth in another city? And that Dr. Stone Dan remembered how he had looked at Iris during their last visit together, how he had pronounced her name, too familiarly for a doctor. The next morning, after dropping Iris off at work, Dan made a decision. He didn't go to the factory, but to the medical center. "I'd like to speak to Dr. Stone," he said to the receptionist. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's about my wife, Iris Brown. I'm her husband." A few minutes later, Dan was sitting in the office across from Michael Stone. The doctor looked calm, but Dan noticed the tension in his posture. "How can I help you, Mr. Brown?" "I want to talk about my wife's condition. She's been very nervous lately, talking about possible complications. Is there any real cause for concern?" Michael was silent for a few seconds, choosing his words carefully. "Your wife is healthy, and the pregnancy is progressing normally. But you understand, first births always cause anxiety in women. Why so many extra consultations? Usually doctors see patients once a month. In the last trimester, monitoring should be more frequent. It's standard practice." Dan nodded, but something about the doctor's manner didn't convince him. "Doctor, can I ask you a direct question? Is there something more between you and my wife than a doctor-patient relationship?" There was a pause. Michael felt his heart racing. He was prepared for anything, but not for a direct confrontation with Iris's husband. "Mr. Brown, I don't understand what you're getting at." "I'm getting at the fact that my wife has changed. She's distant and secretive, and it started after your regular meetings. Perhaps you should talk to your wife about this, not me." "I'm talking to you because if there's something going on between you, I have a right to know." Michael stood up from the table. "Mr. Brown, I understand your concern, but your accusations are unfounded. I treat your wife as a patient and nothing more." Dan also stood up. He was bigger and stronger than the doctor, and now it felt especially acute. "If I find out you're lying, then what? Then I'll have to protect my family." After Dan left, Michael sat in his office for a long time, thinking about what had happened. The situation was getting out of control. He needed to talk to Iris urgently, to convince her to make a decision. That evening, a tense silence reigned at the Brown household during dinner. Dan agonized over how to start the conversation with his wife, while Iris sensed that something had changed in his behavior. "Dan, what's wrong? You've been gloomy all day." "Iris, I went to see Dr. Stone today." She froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Why?" "I wanted to find out about your condition. You've been so nervous lately." "And what did he say?" "That everything is fine. But you know, he seemed just as nervous as you." Iris carefully put her fork down on her plate. "Maybe he had a hard day. Or maybe there's something you're not telling me." "What do you mean?" Dan looked his wife straight in the eye. "Iris, is there more between you and Dr. Stone than a doctor-patient relationship?" The question hung in the air like a sentence. Iris knew that her fate was being decided at that moment. She could lie, as she had done so many times before, or she could finally tell the truth and destroy the life of the man who had loved her for 6 years. "Dan, just answer honestly, yes or no?" Iris closed her eyes, feeling tears roll down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. Dan felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed was still a shock. "How long?" "A month." "Did you sleep with him?" "Dan, please. Did you sleep with him?" "Yes." Dan stood up from the table so abruptly that he knocked it over. "What about the baby? Is it mine?" Iris was silent for a long time, and that silence was her answer. "God!" Dan grabbed his head. "All this month you've been lying to my face. I was planning our future, preparing the nursery, dreaming about teaching my son to play football. And he's not even my son!" "Dan, I didn't want it to turn out this way." "You didn't want it? You cheated on me with the doctor who delivered my child. Or rather, his child." Dan began to pace the kitchen like a caged animal. Iris saw something in his eyes that frightened her. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. But one thing I know for sure is that that bastard is going to pay for destroying my family." "Dan, don't. It's not his fault. It's me. You both betrayed me. And if you think you're going to get away with it, you're very much mistaken." Dan grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" "To get some air before I do something stupid." After he left, Iris sat at the table in the empty house, realizing that her world had just fallen apart. The truth was out, and now there was no telling where it would lead. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Havensville with a deceptive blanket of peace, beneath which passions were raging that could destroy several lives at once. 3 days passed in deathly silence. Dan slept in the garage, coming home only to change before work. Iris paced around the house like a hunted animal, not knowing what to do next. She didn't answer Michael's calls. After the truth came out, she couldn't bring herself to talk to him. On Thursday morning, Iris went into labor. She woke up at 5 in the morning with a sharp pain in her lower abdomen. At first, she thought it was just the usual discomfort of the last weeks of pregnancy, but the pain returned 15 minutes later, then 10 minutes later. "Dan!" she shouted, but there was no answer. He had already left for work. Iris struggled to get out of bed and reach the phone. Her first impulse was to call Michael, but she dialed Jane's number instead. "Jane, I think I'm in labor," she said, trying to sound calm. "What now? How does it feel?" "Contractions every 10 minutes. Not very strong, but regular. I'm on my way. Call Dan." Iris tried to call her husband, but his phone was unavailable. The factory had poor reception, especially in the workshops. Jane arrived half an hour later and found her friend sitting in the kitchen, clutching the edge of the table during another contraction. "How often?" she asked. "Every 7 minutes now. It's getting worse." "Then it's time to go to the hospital. What about Dan?" "He's not answering. Let's go without him." On the way to the medical center, the contractions became more frequent, coming every 5 minutes. Iris squeezed Jane's hand and prayed silently that everything would go well. A nurse met them in the emergency room. "Are you in labor? Please go to the maternity ward." Iris changed into a hospital gown and lay down on a couch in the pre-delivery room. The contractions grew stronger, and between the waves of pain, she thought about what was about to happen, something she had both been waiting for and dreading. At 10 o'clock, Dr. Stone entered the room. When he saw Iris, he lost his professional composure for a second. "How are you? When did the contractions start?" he asked, putting on gloves. "At 5 in the morning, now every 3 minutes." Michael examined her. 4 centimeters dilated. "Everything is going well, but it will be a few more hours before the baby is born." "And your husband?" asked the nurse. "He couldn't make it," Iris replied quickly. Michael frowned but said nothing. Meanwhile, at the factory, Tom Wilson finally got through to Dan. "Brown, your wife is having a baby. Some woman named Jane called." Dan turned pale. Despite everything that had happened, the thought that Iris might need him sobered him up. "Which hospital?" "Our local one. Hurry." Dan dropped everything and rushed to the medical center. On the way, conflicting thoughts raced through his mind. He was angry with Iris, feeling betrayed and humiliated. But she was still his wife, and she was giving birth to the child he had been waiting for 6 years, even if that child wasn't his. At the hospital, Dan burst into the maternity ward like a hurricane. "Where's my wife? Iris Brown!" "Room 3, the nurse pointed. Dan threw open the door and saw Iris on the couch. She was pale, her hair stuck to her face with sweat. Dr. Stone was standing next to her. "How are you, baby?" Dan approached the bed, forgetting everything except that the woman he loved was in pain. "Dan," Iris reached out to him. "I thought you weren't coming." "Of course I came. I'm your husband." Dr. Stone watched the scene with a stony face. Dan's presence in the delivery room was pure torture for him. "Mr. Brown," he said in an official tone, "your wife is doing well. The delivery is proceeding normally." "Thank you, doctor." Dan looked at him with barely concealed hostility. The next 3 hours passed in tense silence. Dan held Iris's hand and helped her breathe through the contractions, but there was no longer any intimacy between them. Every time Dr. Stone entered the room, the atmosphere became even more tense. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the contractions reached their peak. "It's time to move to the delivery room," Michael announced. Iris was wheeled into the delivery room on a gurney. Dan wanted to go with her, but the doctor stopped him. "I'm sorry, but only medical personnel are allowed in the delivery room." "Why? Husbands are allowed to be present at births everywhere else." "Not in our clinic. Safety regulations." Dan realized that these weren't regulations, but Stone's desire to be alone with Iris at such an important moment. "No," he said firmly. "I'm going with my wife." "Mr. Brown." "It's my child!" Dan exploded. As he said the words, he realized how bitterly ironic they were. Michael and Dan stood facing each other in the hospital corridor. The tension between them was so thick that the air seemed to crackle with electricity. "All right," the doctor finally said, "but you must follow all instructions." In the delivery room, Iris was already experiencing contractions. The pain was unbearable, but she knew that in a few more minutes, it would all be over. "Push, Iris!" Michael commanded. "Just a little more!" Dan stood at the head of the bed, holding his wife's hand and watching with pain as the child who was not his blood came into the world. At 2:30 a.m., a boy was born. "Congratulations, it's a boy," Michael said, taking the baby. Dan looked at the newborn and his heart skipped a beat. Even though he knew the truth, the baby was beautiful. Tiny, red, screaming at the top of his lungs, but alive and healthy. "Let me hold him," he asked. Michael hesitated for a second, but handed the baby to Dan. He carefully took the boy in his arms, and his eyes filled with tears. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "It doesn't matter whose blood you are. I've been waiting 6 years for you." Iris lay on the bed, watching the scene, crying with relief and grief at the same time. But the idyll did not last long. Half an hour later, when Iris was transferred to the postpartum ward and the baby was taken to the nursery, tension arose again between the men. "Now that it's over, we need to talk," Dan said to Dr. Stone. "About what?" "About what happens next. My family." Michael looked toward the room where Iris was lying. "That's not for us to decide. It's her choice." "No, it's my choice. I'm her husband." "Legally, but she loves me." "And I loved her for 6 years, before you came along and ruined everything." The men's voices grew louder. Nurses in the hallway began to turn around. "Mr. Brown, calm down. You're in a hospital. Don't tell me what to do. You destroyed my family." "I gave Iris what you could never give her. Understanding, respect, true love." "You gave her nothing but lies and betrayal." At that moment, Iris's scream rang out from the room. "Doctor, something's wrong!" Michael rushed to her, Dan following close behind. Iris was lying on the bed, clutching the sheets, her face contorted in pain. "Bleeding," Michael quickly diagnosed as he examined her. "She needs emergency surgery." "What does that mean?" Dan asked. "Postpartum complications. Not critical, but it requires immediate intervention." Iris grabbed Dan's hand. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "Never," he replied, despite all the pain and hurt. She was taken to the operating room. Dan waited in the hallway, tormented by uncertainty. Despite the betrayal, despite the lies, he couldn't imagine life without Iris. The operation lasted 2 hours. When Michael emerged from the operating room, his face was relieved. "Everything's fine, the bleeding has stopped, she'll be okay." Dan sighed with relief, but then looked at the doctor with hatred again. "Now we'll finish our conversation." "Dan, not here," Michael said, removing his surgical gloves. "Let's go to my office." They walked down the hallway to Dr. Stone's office. Dan closed the door behind him. "So what are you going to do?" Michael asked. "I'm going to take my wife home. And if you ever come near her again..." "What then?" "I'll kill you," Michael smiled. "Empty threats won't solve the problem. Iris will make her own choice. She already has, 6 years ago, when she married me. That was before she met me." "You're a conceited bastard." Dan took a step toward the doctor. "And you're a primitive savage who can't give a woman what she needs. But I can give you what you need." "And what's that?" Dan yanked open the desk drawer and grabbed the surgical scissors lying there. A lesson in what happens to people who destroy other people's families. Dan? Don't be an idiot. Put that down. No. You've played with my life for too long. Michael backed away toward the wall, but it was too late. Dan thrust the scissors into his chest with one swift motion. Dr. Stone fell to the floor, blood gushing from the wound in his chest. He tried to say something, but only bloody foam came out of his throat. Dan stood over him, breathing heavily, still clutching the bloody scissors. "Now my family is safe," he whispered. Michael Stone died a few minutes later, choking on his own blood on the floor of his office. Dan sat next to the body, staring into space. The rage that had been boiling inside him for the last few days suddenly evaporated, leaving only emptiness and horror at what he had done. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. A nurse was looking for the doctor. Iris had woken up from the anesthesia and was asking for him. "Dr. Stone?" There was a knock on the office door. Dan looked at his bloodied hands, at the body on the floor, and realized that his life had just ended. The door opened, and the nurse saw a scene that would remain in her memory forever. Her scream echoed through the hospital corridors, announcing that the first murder in 20 years had taken place in the quiet town of Havensville. In the postpartum ward, Iris lay unaware that the man she loved was dead, and that the man she had betrayed would become a murderer. The nurse's scream broke the silence of the hospital corridors. Within minutes, security guards, medical staff, and the police gathered in Dr. Stone's office. Dan Brown sat next to the body, not resisting or trying to run away. The bloody scissors lay at his feet. Detective Linda Harris was the first to arrive at the scene, a 42-year-old woman with a stern face and attentive gray eyes. In her 15 years with the Havenville Police Department, she had investigated many cases, from petty theft to drug trafficking, but this was her first murder. "Everyone out of the office," she ordered. "Call the Columbus crime scene team." Dan looked up when she approached him. "Mr. Brown, do you understand what's happening?" "Yes," he replied quietly. "Did you kill Dr. Stone?" "Yes." "Why?" Dan was silent for a long time, staring at Michael's body. "He destroyed my family." Detective Harris nodded to the patrol officer. "Arrest him, charge him with first-degree murder." As Dan was being handcuffed, he asked, "Detective, my wife is in the maternity ward. She just gave birth and doesn't know about this. Please tell her gently." Linda Harris looked into his eyes for a long time, seeing not the coldness of a murderer, but the deep despair of a man who had lost everything. In room 7, Iris was slowly coming to after the anesthesia. Her head was heavy, her mouth was dry, but most importantly, she was alive, and her baby was alive. "Nurse!" she called weakly to the nurse. "How's my son?" "Everything's fine, Mrs. Brown. The boy is healthy and weighs 3 kilograms, 200 grams. Where's Dr. Stone?" The nurse hesitated. "A police detective will be with you shortly. She'll explain everything." Iris felt her heart skip a beat. "What happened? Where's my husband?" A few minutes later, Detective Harris entered the room. Her face was serious and sympathetic at the same time. "Mrs. Brown, my name is Linda Harris. I'm a detective with the local police. I have some very difficult news to tell you. Has something happened to Dan? Your husband has been arrested. He is accused of murdering Dr. Michael Stone." The detective's words hit her like a physical blow. Iris felt the world around her collapse completely. "No, this can't be. You must be mistaken." "Unfortunately, no. Your husband confessed. The murder took place an hour ago in the doctor's office." Iris covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. Everything she had feared had come true. Her betrayal had led to a tragedy that had destroyed everyone's lives. "Mrs. Brown, I need to ask you a few questions. I understand that this is difficult for you, but I know why you're here," Iris said through her tears. "I had an affair with Dr. Stone. Dan found out 3 days ago." Detective Harris took out her notebook. "Tell me more about your relationship with the victim." For the next hour, Iris recounted how her affair with Michael had begun, their meetings, and how Dan had found out the truth. It was excruciatingly painful to talk about, but she knew there was nothing left to hide. "What about the child?" the detective asked. "Michael's son. Iris whispered. Dan knew about him. That could have been a motive for murder. Detective, can I see my husband? He's giving a statement right now. Maybe tomorrow. When the detective left, Iris was left alone with her grief. The man she loved was dead. The husband she had cheated on had become a murderer. And she was lying in a hospital room with a child in her arms, realizing that she was to blame for everything that had happened. At the police station, Dan sat in a holding cell. He refused a lawyer, saying he was ready to admit his guilt and serve his sentence. Mr. Brown, Detective Harris came in that evening. Your wife told us about your affair with Dr. Stone. She confirmed that you knew about the child's paternity. Fine. That gives us the full picture of the motive. Murder out of jealousy and revenge. Yes, that's right. Why aren't you trying to defend yourself? A good lawyer could get you a lighter sentence. Temporary insanity, heat of passion? Dan raised his head and looked at the detective. Because I killed a man. It doesn't matter what my reasons were. I took a life. But you have a wife, a newborn son. He's not my son. And my wife made her choice when she started seeing that doctor. Detective Harris had seen many criminals in her career. But Dan Brown was special. There was no cunning, no desire to escape punishment. Only the deep, all-consuming pain of a man who had lost everything he held dear. News of the murder spread instantly throughout Havensville. In a town where everyone knew each other, such an event was a real shock. At the factory where Dan worked, his colleagues couldn't believe that the quiet, reliable mechanic was a murderer. I never would have thought it, Tom Wilson told his wife over dinner. Dan was a good guy, but when a man finds out his wife is cheating on him, anything can happen. At the Midwest Freight Solutions office, Jane Foster was trying to cope with the shock. Her best friend was in the hospital, her friend's husband was in jail for murder, and her friend's lover was dead. I should have suspected something, she told her boss, who let her take the day off. All those extra doctor's appointments, Iris's strange behavior. Don't blame yourself, Jane. No one could have predicted this outcome. 3 days later, Iris was discharged from the hospital with her baby. Jane met her at the exit. Going home, where everything reminded her of her happy life with Dan, was unbearable. You can stay with me for now, her friend said. Home means too much right now. Iris nodded, rocking her son in her arms. She named the boy Michael, in memory of the father he would never know. Jane, it's all my fault. If I hadn't... Stop it. Dan is a grown man and he made his own decision. He killed a man because of me. He killed a man because of his jealousy and pride. It was his choice, not yours. But Iris knew that no matter what her friends said, she would carry the burden of guilt for the rest of her life. The trial began 2 months later. Dan Brown appeared in court charged with first-degree murder. The prosecutor demanded life imprisonment, given the premeditated nature of the crime. Iris came to the hearing with her child in her arms. She sat in the courtroom so that Dan could see her. When their eyes met, she saw no malice or accusation in them, only deep sadness. Defendant, the judge addressed him. Do you plead guilty to the murder of Michael Stone? I do, Dan replied clearly. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Dan stood up and looked around the courtroom. His gaze rested on Iris. Your Honor, I am not asking for leniency. I killed a man, and I must answer for that under the law. I will say only this. I do not regret defending my family. I only regret that things went so far. The sentence was harsh. 25 years in prison with no parole. Dan was led away in handcuffs, and Iris knew she was seeing her husband for the last time. After the trial, she approached Detective Harris. Can I visit him in prison? Of course, but think carefully. It might be better to start a new life. He's still my husband, and the father of my child. Not biologically, but truly. A week later, Iris and little Michael drove to the maximum security prison 2 hours away from Havensville. The visit took place through glass, over the phone. Dan looked haggard but calm. How are you, baby? He asked. We're managing. How are you? Getting used to it. I have time to think about a lot of things here. Dan, I'm sorry. For everything. No, Iris, don't apologize. You were looking for happiness and there's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is that I couldn't give it to you. You were a good husband, but not the one you needed. Iris lifted the baby so Dan could see him. He's growing up. He's looking more and more like Michael. That's good. Let him grow up healthy. And don't tell him about me when he's older. Tell him his father died a hero. Dan, promise me, this boy must not carry the burden of what happened. I promise. 5 years passed. Iris never divorced Dan, although she could have. She moved to another state, found a job at a logistics company, and raised her son. Little Michael grew up to be a smart and kind boy, and sometimes Iris saw in his features the father he never knew. Once a month, she wrote letters to Dan in prison. She told him about their son, her work, and her life. He rarely replied, but his letters were full of warmth and concern for her and the child. In one letter, he wrote, "Iris, I don't regret what I did. Stone took the most precious thing from me, and I took his life. It was a fair exchange, but I do regret that you are suffering because of it. You deserve happiness, and I hope you find it someday." Detective Harris, who had become the chief of police in Havensville, sometimes thought about the case. In her files, it was listed as a solved murder motivated by jealousy, but she understood that behind the dry wording lay a human tragedy. "You know," she would say to her husband over dinner, "there were no real guilty or innocent parties in that case. There were just people who made choices, and those choices led to tragedy." Havensville gradually forgot about the murder of Dr. Stone. Life in the small town went on as usual. People were born and died, businesses opened and closed, children grew up and moved away to the big cities.